Happy New Year guys, Crave here, and let's open the year with a basic guide on how you can deal damage as an Affliction lock. Now, Warlords is running on its last legs, but in case you were trying out a new class or you had basically some Warlock lying around with nothing to do, then this video might be something you might want to check out. The Affliction spec is the damage over time spec, or the dot spec for the class. You are basically expected to throw a lot of dots, more dots, and making sure they are up 100% of the time. Now, there are also other abilities you'll need to use, but I'll mention them while going through this guide. Now, as with most of my other videos, pick any of the options you're seeing in your screen right now to jump straight into that section of this guide. I'll go ahead with the talents part if you don't make a selection. Okay, talents time. So for the first tier, it's really just about Dark Region or Soul Leech for this tier, and what it does is both actually just increases your survivability. Now, it's very situational. If you can't use Haunt or Drain Soul like in AoE scenarios, then Dark Region will be your pick. If you don't want to think about things too much, the passive shield you get from Leech is a pretty good option. The second row is quite simple. It's mainly just about Shadow Fury. It's a very useful control ability if you're especially if you're on ads duty, and yeah, even in PvP, it's a very useful talent. So yep, it's just about that. I normally run with Soul Link because it requires no action on your part for this tier. It also provides some minor healing. Now, if you expect big damage to hit you, then you can use Pact, but you have to make sure that your demon is up and healthy. Now, if your pet's dead, then it's still useful to sort of use this ability if your healer can top you off when you activate Pact. Now, this still gives you a whole lot of room for a healer to work with, but not as much as having your pet alive. The mobility you gain from Tier 4's Burning Rush is amazing, especially if you have nothing on your gear that increases your move speed. Now, just make sure to watch your health or take advantage of it if you have some sort of absorb or shield up on yourself. And if you're not relying on a racial, then basically Unbound Will is a good pick to get you out of a CC effect. Again, with that Unbound Will ability, just make sure to watch your health. Among the three grimoires for Tier 5, I prefer Supremacy and Sacrifice. Now, Supremacy is excellent if you have to switch targets, but if you have to tunnel a raid boss and you are able to make maximum use of drains, then Sac is a better option. Now, Supremacy is great to start off with since it will require less management. Now, if you do pick Sac or Sacrifice, make sure to keep in mind when the damage buff is about to wear off. On to Tier 6. Now, because of the damage over time nature of the spec, then Archimonde's Darkness is really just a pick for me. Just make sure to time the requirement for the Haunt target debuff properly, and watch when you have to refresh abilities like Unstable Affliction. Now, Darkness adding a second charge to Dark Soul is simply amazing and allows you to gain the powerful haste buff more frequently. Cunning can also be a pick if you have trouble positioning yourself in fights or you've picture yourself just quickly moving frequently in the raid encounter. But yep, Archimonde's Darkness is my preferred pick. The final tier has useful options, but I do prefer Soul Burn in most scenarios. Now, Cataclysm has great burst potential and automatically applies 2 of your 3 dots. Now, just keep in mind that if you go with the talent, the Soul Burn talent, the target you hit with it takes more damage compared to other targets. So you may want to prioritize which target will get hit by Haunt. Okay, stat priority time, and let's look at the stats that Affliction Warlocks want to prioritize. So you've got Intellect, Haste, Mastery, and Multi-Strike. Now, Intellect, as with most classes having a primary stat, is the best stat to aim for. Now, along with Spell Power, it provides the most contribution to your overall DPS, so prioritize this in some situations like choosing between 2 stat trinkets or some other secondary gear that is non-proc. Now, the second stat there, I know it says Haste, but it's very close to Mastery. Now, since this is a basic guide, I will say that either of the two will be good, but you must keep them close to each other. Now, Haste is excellent because it allows you to get your spells off faster, but Mastery makes your spells, shall we say, more efficient because your dots are stronger. So, basically, just keep them balanced. If you're asking for personal preference, then I like Haste to be a bit higher, but only by a bit because it allows for me to launch Haunt quicker, and this is noticeable in movement heavy fights. Now, having a decent amount of Mastery is a good thing to go for. If you're up for swapping into, let's say, a different spec like Destruction. Now, for your buffs, just follow the same priority I mentioned. Find anything that offers Intellect or Spell Power, then anything that provides Haste or Mastery. Now, if you went the Tanan route in gearing, just be patient. I would suggest being patient if that's possible, and just basically wait for the baleful items that will provide both haste and mastery for the secondary stats. Now, those items that have the sort of perfect mix of stats are where you want to spend your empowered Apex's crystals on. And as I also mentioned in my character boost video, I guess I'll just go ahead and mention it again. Consider going the Ashran route for gearing up. Now, again, as I mentioned there, the honor pieces alone are already at level 700, but cannot be upgraded. Just keep in mind that they cannot be upgraded through Valor. So if you're lucky in getting drops from Hellfire, then I suggest you sort of just get your missing pieces from, well, Ashran or the PvP route. Okay, let's look at your abilities as an Affliction Warlock. So the three primary ones are Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction. Now, these three dots will make up most of your damage output in fights, and you can see this if you hover above your damage meter, let's say Scada or Recount. Ideally, these three should come out on top. Now, these dots are enhanced by your Mastery rating, as I mentioned earlier, but it's also further enhanced by the next ability you're seeing, which is Haunt. Now, Haunt is a cast time spell, but it hits like a truck, and as I mentioned, it increases dot damage by 35%. Now, Drain Soul is your, well, it's your spell to use when you don't have any other spell to cast, and is recommended to keep up due to its effect on your other damage overtime spells. Now, Seed of Corruption is your sort of go-to spell in big AoE situations, so I think it's some, well, I think it functions like a mage's living bomb, but I don't play a mage, so don't quote me on that. Now, basically what Seed of Corruption does is that it plants a DOT effect on your target, and it will eventually, after a certain time or after a certain threshold of damage, it will detonate, dealing a decent amount of AoE damage. Now, if you buff it with the next ability called Soul Burn, what happens during detonation is that all targets within range are affected by your Corruption spell. Now, Soul Burn, while we're at it, is basically, as you can see with Seed of Corruption, is that it buffs several of your spells and it will cost a Soul Shard. So if you pick, let's say, for your tier 7 talent Haunt, then it also buffs your damage overtime effects further. So you get the damage buff from Haunt, and then you get additional buff from Soul Burn. And again, just as a reminder, when you do this, just make sure to track your soul shard count. You don't want to be running out of soul shards during an encounter. Now, while we're at it, let's get into those abilities affected by soul burn. So just their basic effects. So Summon Demon, well, it's pretty easy. You get to summon the demon you want. You also have Soul Swap. It copies your DOT effects from one target to another. So you basically just have a 3-second window to do this. And you also have your glyph suggestion there, which is a soul swap, glyph of soul swap. Now, what it does is that instead of a 3-second window to sort of copy over your DOT effects to another target, you are given a 30-second window. Now, just going back to Soul Burn, what's amazing about Soul Burn is that it removes the requirement to have an existing target with all your dots already running. So it's very good, as you'll see later in the single target scenario or the rotations for single target scenarios. It's very good to basically open up on a target and just instantly apply all 3 of your dots. Now, the last ability is Demonic Circle. It's very useful for positioning in fights. It's basically sort of a limited form of mobility, but it's still really good. Now, again, just you've got to be careful when using swap, as it takes a soul shard. I mentioned this just maybe just a few seconds ago. It's very rare that you will need to use this unless you're in a bind and you have no time to recast your dots on another target. Since I mentioned Demonic Circle, I'll also insert Gateway as another ability that, well, sort of has limited use. So this gives you some mobility in an encounter, especially if you're able to get to a group that will, well, position a raid boss or a mob effectively. So in addition to Circle and maybe Burning Rush if you pick that talent, Warlocks have some pretty good movement options. The next 2 abilities are sort of your burst abilities, and the first one is Dark Soul Misery. So this is your main DPS buff, and you'd basically want to keep this up as much as you can, and it would really be easier to do so if you picked Archimonde's Darkness as your tier 6 talent. Now, just make sure to line it up properly with more important parts of the fight. Let's say the pull, let's say you have a priority burst target, or during the burn phase. Now, the second burst cooldown that you have is Summon Infernal or Summon Doomguard. This is basically your once per fight add-on burst. The Doomguard is usable in most scenarios due to the Doombolt attack, but you can go with Infernal in, well, scenarios that Let's say you have a very large number of mobs that are grouped together. Now, your Infernal also acts as additional CC with the stun effect that it has during the summon part. Okay, moving on to your other useful abilities. So the first one is Create Soulwell, and if you forget to do it during a raid, and especially if you just sort of grouped up together for the first time, you're gonna get messages and a couple of yells once in a while, as people will be looking for it. Now, Soulwell just really helps everyone out when they're in a pinch. I only added the glyph to make it easier to spot. Before I actually used the glyph, people would still ask me for Soulwell, for the Soulwell to drop, even though I already created one for the group. I think it's, I don't know whether people are just lazy and looking for it, or maybe it's a tile set where the Soulwell sort of blends into the background. But yeah, the glyph is, well, somewhat useful. Now, the next ability is called Soulstone, and it's really useful, but you got to be cautious on who you place it on and when to use it. Now, it's always recommended to cast the Soulstone ability before the fight, but again, who you cast it on and for what purpose is important. Now, the normal target is the tank who takes on heavy damage, so he can sort of pop back up if he dies. Sometimes it's also the person who is sort of guaranteed to die, or even the person who's sort of assigned to do the mass rest if, or the person who's sort of trusted to do the mass rest. Now, the battle resurrection system considers resurrection taken and not the application, so this is the important part. So if you do decide to apply it on yourself and get ready to sort of get some hate in certain scenarios, just make sure not to immediately accept the resurrection option when you die. If some, well, how do we say this? Some more important member of the raid is about to die or is dead, then that person should have priority for the battle resurrection. Now, in more coordinated situations, I think the raid leader should be the one to call out who gets the combat resurrection benefit. Okay, we have 3 more abilities before we get into the rotations. So you have Soul Shatter, and that's easy to understand. You also have Life Tap and Dark Intent. Now, the last ability, Dark Intent, is just something you'll just simply get used to applying before the start of any fight. Alright, so let's see how you make use of these abilities, and we'll start off with the single target scenarios first. So, for your opener, it's basically just Soul Burn, Soul Swap, and apply it on a target, then hit Dark Soul, and then eventually Haunt. Now, after those 3 in your opener, you're gonna have to go through or sort of juggle through different things in the middle of the fight. So, as you're seeing on your screen, you just make sure to keep your 3 primary damage over time effects up on your target. Keep Dark Soul, but consider, make sure to keep Dark Soul up, but make sure to consider the important phases of a fight. Soul Burn Haunt should be kept up as much as possible. Of course, consider your shard count. Haunt should be reapplied when you get a buff or a proc from your trinket or a Dark Soul, or when you don't want to waste shards. And Drain Soul basically is just your filler spell. Just make sure to cast it when you're not doing anything else. Now, I know there's a lot going on, especially once you get into a fight, you're going to notice that, there's a lot of things to watch. But the general idea is to make sure that your dots never fall off, and you basically just buff your dot damage as much as you can whenever appropriate. Now, if for some reason, again, if for some special reason you allow one of your dots, or you simply allow one of your dots to just drop off, it should never be agony. Now, you should also, as I mentioned for Haunt you should also avoid being shard capped, as there's always a possibility for you to gain a soul shard from corruption. Now, the opposite is also true to not allow a scenario where you will have 0 shards, as you might find yourself in a situation where your trinket might proc, or all of a sudden your shaman or someone in the raid group just decides to use bloodlust or heroism. So shard count management is really important. Now, in AoE situations, well, as you're seeing on your screen right now, just keep it in mind. If you have fewer than 5, and these are just well, at least this is just the number I'm comfortable with. If you have fewer than 5 targets, just make sure to keep your normal rotation up on all mobs, or at the very least, make sure all your dots are ticking on every single mob. Now, if you're seeing more than 5, then I think you've got 2 options. You've got Soul Burn, Seed of Corruption, and try to apply your other damage over time effects on as many mobs as possible, watching their timers before they sort of drop off. Or if there's just simply too much and you just don't want to trouble yourself with keeping up all those dots, then spamming Seed of Corruption will also do. especially in situations where the mobs will just die off pretty quick. Now, for both scenarios, single target and AoE, I admit that I personally find it difficult at times to keep up, especially that single target situation. But this is really what's exciting about Affliction. It's what a friend of mine introduced me to about the class back when I learned about the game in Wrath of the Lich King, and I've always liked the design. I mean, it's great. I mean, initially it felt like, yeah, you're just keeping up your dots, but you know, with the amount of attention that you have to focus on for, you know, in keeping up your dots, especially in single target situations, yeah, it's pretty good. I do miss the, I just forgot the situation for it, but there used to be like an ability that allowed you to proc a free shadow bolt. I do miss that part, but yeah, overall, at least from memory, I think the feel is still the same. And for the last part of this guide, it's macros and add-ons, and one useful macro is the one for Soulstone, and it's similar to any other mouse over macro from my previous guides, so you're seeing it on your screen right now. I think you can also have one for Soul Shatter if the aggro swap, or it's a bit sudden, basically, if the mob just sort of faces your direction and is just ready to destroy you, so you can use this for Soul Shatter. Now, for add-ons, it's basically the same with any guides I've done, so it's just ELVUI, Deadly Boss Moss, and SCADA. Now, for this guide, however, I'd like to suggest Tell Me When, as I did in my Death Knight guide. It will really help with management of all the things going on, especially as an Affliction Warlock. Now, there are other add-ons out there that sort of perform the same function, but Tell Me When is really just my pick. And that's it for this Affliction Warlock guide, while we don't have Legion dropping anytime soon. But yeah, during this phase, while waiting for the next expansion, if you wanted to try out the class, then I hope this gets you started. Now, there are many more specifics and things to consider with the Warlock class, especially with Affliction, but this simplified guide should help you get into the lock spec. So check out my other videos, guys, and don't forget to like and sub if you haven't. Have fun.